Okay, so imagine this, right? You're a college student. It's 1983. The Cold War is like at its peak,
Yeah.
and you're visiting Moscow.
Oh, wow.
You lose your airline ticket in the subway.
Oh, no.
Total panic, right?
Yeah.
But then, out of nowhere, this woman in a blue coat just like appears
Mhm.
and finds it for you. I
What?
mean, it sounds like a scene from a spy movie.
It does. It totally does. And, it really captures that feeling of paranoia and suspicion that just hung over everything back then.
Right.
Yeah, Don Wildman, the guy who told this story, he was visiting Moscow at a pretty tense time. Like Reagan had just put missiles in Europe
Mm-hmm.
and the Soviets were furious. And his friend's mother, who was the U.S. ambassador's wife,
Okay.
she even warned him about like constant KGB surveillance.
Oh, wow. And it
Yeah.
gets even weirder.
Well,
He later finds out that this helpful stranger was probably like his assigned KGB handler,
oh my gosh.
keeping tabs on him.
That's crazy. It makes you wonder just what was going on beneath the surface back then.
Right? Like every interaction could have been like this secret game of chess.
Exactly. And that's what makes this story such a great intro to our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at Netflix's Turning Point, the bomb in the Cold War,
Oh, yeah, I've heard good things about that.
and we've got some incredible insights to guide us
Okay.
from three people featured in the audio we're working from.
Cool.
Brian Knappenberger,
Hmm.
who directed the series. Then there's Archie Brown, a top Cold War historian,
Wow.
and Andrei Soldatov, he's a journalist,
Okay.
specializing in, you guessed it, Russian secret services.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty intense area of expertise.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
But with their perspectives, we can really get into like how complicated this whole era was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Its lasting impact and why it feels like it never really ended.
Okay, so like the Cold War shadow is still looming over us. I'm ready to dive in.
All right, well, let's start with Brian Knappenberger, the director.
Okay.
He makes this really interesting point about nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah.
He says they're basically the starting point, the genesis of the Cold War.
Okay, that makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, and he uses this analogy of like dropping a pebble in a pond,
Mm.
where the first splash is the atomic bomb, and
Yeah.
then the Cold War is all the ripples spreading out, changing everything. Global politics, society, everything.
Wow. That's like a really powerful image.
It is.
I mean, it really shows how big this whole thing was, like how far-reaching the consequences were.
Right. And speaking of that initial splash,
Mhm.
Knappenberger also talks about the Trinity test,
Mhm.
the first successful atomic bomb detonation.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And it's crazy, right?
What?
At the Potsdam Conference, Truman told Stalin about it,
Yeah.
but Stalin already knew.
Wait, what?
Spies. He had spies
Yeah.
inside the Manhattan Project.
No way. So the US was trying to play it cool, like, hey, look what we did. But Stalin's over there, like, yeah, I know.
Exactly.
That's wild. It just shows how much distrust there was from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah. Immediate suspicion, secrets everywhere. Both sides were obsessed with building bigger and badder weapons,
Yeah.
which led to this crazy idea, mutually assured destruction.
MAD, right. Like if one side launches nukes, the other one retaliates and everybody gets wiped out.
Exactly. The fear of total annihilation became the foundation for global stability.
Okay, so the world was held hostage by the threat of nuclear war. It's like a messed up paradox.
Totally. It stopped direct conflict between the superpowers, but it also led to all those proxy wars, espionage, the creation of the CIA, the KGB.
Right, all this stuff happening in the shadows because nobody wanted to risk all-out nuclear war.
It was a high-stakes game, the fate of the world hanging in the balance.
And we're talking decades of this, like this constant tension, this fear.
Yeah, forcing the conflict underground didn't make it any less dangerous, maybe even more so, because it got into everything. International relations, domestic policies, even our culture.
It's almost like the Cold War became this invisible force shaping everything.
Exactly. And here's where things take an unexpected turn. Archie Brown, the historian, he brings up this, surprising figure,
Who?
Margaret Thatcher.
The Iron Lady.
Yeah, not exactly who you'd think of as a peacemaker, right?
Not really.
But Brown's book, The Human Factor, it shows how crucial Thatcher was in bridging the gap between Reagan and Gorbachev. Like, she played this unsung role.
Okay, but how did she change her mind about the Soviets? I mean, she was like a hardcore anti-communist, wasn't she?
She was, but Brown says it was her personal encounters with Gorbachev.
Oh, interesting.
She saw him as like a different kind of Soviet leader,
Yeah.
someone who genuinely wanted reform. And the important thing is
Yeah.
she got Reagan to see that too. Reagan was super distrustful of Gorbachev and the Soviets in general.
So Thatcher convinced Reagan to give Gorbachev a chance, basically.
Exactly. And that's like a huge turning point.
Okay, but I always thought the end of the Cold War was because the West had a better economy.
A lot of people think that. But Brown says, while economics played a part, the real reason was those internal changes in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Specifically, Gorbachev's willingness to shake things up. He was open to ideas that were unthinkable before him.
So Gorbachev was the key, not just Western economic power.
Yeah, his leadership really mattered.
So let's talk about those changes.
Mm,
We all know the words perestroika and glasnost, but what did they actually mean?
right. So perestroika, that was about restructuring the Soviet economy,
Okay.
making it more efficient, more responsive to, like, market forces. And glasnost, that was about opening up Soviet society.
Okay, so more freedom of expression, less censorship, that kind of thing.
Exactly. More transparency, allowing some dissent.
Pretty radical stuff for the Soviet Union back then.
Oh, yeah, totally radical.
Right.
There's this paradox with Gorbachev's reforms.
What do you mean?
He wanted to save the Soviet system,
Uh-huh.
but his reforms actually sped up its collapse.
Wow, how did that happen?
Well, Brown says Gorbachev started by wanting to just reform the system, make it work better.
Yeah.
But then he hit resistance from, like, the old guard in the Communist Party.
Those who wanted to keep things the same.
Yeah. So he realized real change meant a much bigger transformation, not just tinkering around the edges.
So perestroika and glasnost weren't just tweaks, they were about fundamentally changing the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And there's this key moment, Gorbachev's speech at the UN.
Yeah.
He basically said every country has the right to choose its own political and economic system.
Wow.
It was a total break from traditional Soviet foreign policy, and it shook the Eastern Bloc.
It was like he was giving them permission to break free.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened.
The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union dissolved.
And while the West was celebrating, things were very different in Russia.
Yeah, I bet. It must have been traumatic for many Russians to see their country, their whole way of life, just fall apart.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our third expert, Andrei Soldatov, and his view on the Russian security services. The end of the Cold War wasn't a happy ending for everyone.
Right.
And you have to understand the historical context. Russia's always felt threatened by outside forces.
Yeah, like they've been invaded a lot throughout history.
Exactly. And Soldatov highlights two events that really fueled that sense of vulnerability.
Okay, which ones?
The 1917 revolution and, of course, the collapse in the Soviet Union.
Both huge, chaotic events that caused a lot of suffering.
Yeah. So for many Russians, the end of the Cold War wasn't about freedom or democracy. It was about losing national pride, their country breaking apart, and this deep fear about the future.
That makes sense.
And this is especially true for Putin. Remember, he called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century.
Right.
And to get Putin, you got to understand his background, his KGB years, how those historical traumas, the revolution and the collapse, they shaped his whole worldview.
So he sees a strong centralized state as essential for protecting Russia from its enemies.
Exactly. Control, order, security, those are his priorities. And that brings us to the unsettling legacy of the Cold War, particularly in Russia's security services.
So the Cold War's influence lingers, especially in those institutions.
Oh, absolutely.
That's like a ghost that won't go away.
It's like they're stuck in this mindset of control at all costs.
Yeah.
Like they have to maintain political stability no matter what.
Yeah.
And that leads to some pretty scary stuff.
Like what?
Well, cracking down on independent media, persecuting political opponents, silencing anyone who, challenges the official line.
So basically they're using the Cold War playbook to deal with modern problems.
It's a disturbing echo, for
Yeah.
sure. And the war in Ukraine, it's become this tool to reinforce that narrative.
You mean the narrative of Russia as this besieged fortress?
Exactly. They're playing on those old fears, that anxiety about the West.
And that makes it easier to justify aggression, to silence dissent. It's like they're saying, look, we're under attack, so we have to do whatever it takes to defend ourselves.
Right. And Soldatov points out this generational divide that's really important here.
Rick, what's that about?
Younger Russians, the ones who've only known Putin's role,
Yeah.
they're particularly vulnerable to this propaganda.
Because they have no memory of a time before Putin.
Exactly. Their understanding of history is shaped by this narrative that glorifies the Cold War and demonizes the West.
It's like they're trapped in this Cold War time warp, even though the real Cold War ended decades ago.
It's a worrying trend.
It really is. I mean, it makes you wonder, did the Cold War ever really end?
That's the question, isn't it?
Mhm.
The ideologies may have shifted, but those underlying dynamics, that mistrust, the competition, the threat of violence, it's all still there.
And Knappenberger brings up something really scary about nuclear proliferation today. A lot of those Cold War treaties, they've lapsed. There's not a lot of diplomacy happening to control these weapons.
Yeah, that's a huge concern. The danger of nuclear war didn't just vanish with the Berlin Wall. In fact, with more countries getting nukes, with tensions rising between global powers, the risk might be even higher now.
It's like we're sleepwalking into a new era of conflict, but this time the stakes are even higher.
That's why it's so important to look at the Cold War, not just as history, but as, like, a warning. We have to understand how it still shapes our world, what lessons we can learn to avoid making the same mistakes.
So, where do we go from here? How do we break free from this cycle of mistrust and confrontation?
Solotov offers some hope, I think.
Yeah.
He says one way to counter those negative aspects of the Cold War mindset is to promote transparency, accountability, and open dialogue.
Okay, those are all good things, obviously. But how do we actually do that, especially in a world where authoritarianism seems to be on the rise?
Well, Solotov believes that if we shine a light on these shadowy institutions, if we challenge those narratives that fuel fear and mistrust,
Yeah.
then we can start to have more nuanced, more constructive conversations.
So it's about exposing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's about empowering people with information, encouraging critical thinking, getting them to question the narratives they're being fed, to seek out different perspectives.
Yeah, it's like we need more people like that, shining a light on the darkness.
He's a great example, His work is a reminder that change starts with individuals. People willing to challenge the status quo, even if it puts them at risk. I mean, remember his website, Agentura.
Yeah.
It was a thorn in the Kremlin side for years, providing this inside look into Russian intelligence.
It's incredible that he was able to do that for so long.
It is, and now he's in exile, facing treason charges just for speaking out against the war.
Wow. That's insane. It shows how high the stakes are.
Absolutely. His story and the stories of so many others, journalists, activists who are being silenced, it's a wake-up call.
Yeah, we can't take our freedoms for granted. Free speech, free press. It's crucial for holding power accountable and preventing the kinds of things that happened during the Cold War.
You're absolutely right. A free press is essential for any real democracy. It's how we keep things in check.
So what can we do? Like, how can we support this fight for truth and transparency? It feels so huge, Like, what can one person really do?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but every little bit helps. I think we need to amplify the voices of those who are, risking everything to expose the truth.
Okay.
To challenge those narratives that, divide us, that create fear.
Yeah.
Support independent media, have real conversations, and demand better from our leaders.
Those are all things we can do no matter where we are.
Exactly. Every action counts.
Yes. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, the Cold War might be over, but the fight for freedom and democracy, that's still going on.
It is. It's ongoing.
Yeah.
And we're all part of it. We can't
Yeah.
just sit back and watch.
Right. We have to be active, be informed, and be engaged.
Absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and build a better future. One where we prioritize dialogue, understanding, and respect for everyone.
Yeah, a world where we're not constantly looking at each other with suspicion and fear.
Exactly. Where cooperation wins out over conflict.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. The Cold War might be a thing of the past, but the fight for a better future, that's something we can all be a part of. Thanks for listening.